So at the tail end of last year, I talked about quite a few webcams from both OBSBOT and Insta360. We looked at the Link 2, the Link 2C, and the Tiny 2 Lite. Well, I wasn't really able to fully compare them all to one another because I got them all at different times. But now we've got all the cameras and we got an extra one, the Meet 2. So we're going to go ahead and compare them. We have the Insta360 Link 2 and Link 2C. We have the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite and the Meet 2. We're going to go ahead and compare these all. We're going to talk about their physical differences. We're going to talk about their image differences, the video quality, all that kind of stuff, the software differences. As we go through those, I'll talk about where, maybe one does better than the other. We'll compare the gimbals directly against each other and then the static cameras directly against each other and talk about those differences as well. And then once we get to the end, I'll give you a little bit of a roundup, but spoiler alert, these are all really great cameras. And the one that you should choose is really dependent on which strengths or weaknesses you're okay with, or, the ones that you prioritize over the others. Now, all of these cameras were provided to me by the manufacturers, but this video is completely unsponsored. I did not allow either company to sponsor the video because I want this to be as unbiased as possible. And I'm able to do stuff like that because you guys support me on Patreon, using Amazon affiliate links, all those kinds of things. So I really do appreciate it. And one more little update. The software and the firmware on all of these cameras was last updated on 2/11, so it is as up to date as possible as of February 11th, 2025. All right, so we'll start off with the Link 2. It is a physically relatively large camera out of the bunch. The mount is quite small, but the actual camera body is quite a bit bigger. It overall has a big speaker grill on top. This is where the microphones are. And overall looks pretty good. The bottom of the camera itself is magnetic, so you can mount it onto anything magnetic if you wanted to. The stand that it comes with is also magnetic, so them together, it's a really strong magnet. If you go ahead and pull, it'll actually pull the little vertical section of the magnet out. So do keep that in mind. It's a strong magnetic connection, which means it won't move on its own, which is really nice. I'm pretty happy with the overall stand here. If we go ahead and compare that to the OBSBOT has a integrated mount. So this mount is right on the bottom here. It just opens up and closes like this. It's still a pretty good feeling mount. It is stiff enough where I don't feel like I struggle very much trying to keep this thing mounted to a monitor, which is good. It has the screw hole on the bottom, as does the Insta360. The Insta360s is only on the mount. It's not on the actual camera. So you have to have it on the mount for it to be able to be mounted to something. But they both do a pretty good job. And overall, the cameras are somewhat similar in size. The Insta360, though, because the actual camera section is so much bigger, it's a lot wider than the OBSBOT. The OBSBOT is a little bit more contained. And wherever you have this mounted, you don't have to worry about the sides. As long as nothing is within this kind of section, it's not really going to run into too much. Maybe a little bit, but it's a little bit better. With the Insta360, you have to be very careful, and you should probably kind of do a little test around if you have things that are close to make sure it's not going to run into those when using the gimbal. Now, the specs of these two cameras is extremely similar. They both do up to 4K 30 frames per second or 1080p 60 frames per second. They both have a f1.8 aperture. They both use a 1/2-inch CMOS sensor. Their FOVs are just 0.1 degree difference from one another. They both have up to 4x digital zoom. They have their gimbal. They both support gestures. The Insta Link 2 has touch controls, whereas the OBSBOT Tiny 2 Lite does not. They both use a PDAF with an autofocus, and they also have the ability with a manual focus. They both support HDR, although their support is a little bit different, and we'll go through that once we go through the software. And they both use dual omnidirectional microphones. Now, one of the big differences here is the price. The Tiny 2 Lite MSRP is $179, but it does often go on sale, and currently it is on sale for $143, and that is the all-time low price. So do keep that in mind. Whereas the Insta360 Link 2 is standard $199.99, and it has gone on sale a couple of times, but the lowest it's gone down to is $179.99. So it's still going to be the more expensive cameras out of the two. Now, next up is the static cameras, and here we have the Link 2C. So the body is extremely similar to the Link 2. It's literally that camera without the gimbal on it. The body style, the shape of everything is very similar. This one does have an integrated shutter for the privacy shutter, so that's pretty nice, whereas the Link 2 just kind of goes face down and turns off that way. So it's nice that this one has something integrated. Again, you have the grill up top for the integrated microphones. The bottom of this is magnetic, so it'll go ahead and stick onto anything. The mount, again, is also magnetic, but it'll stick to anything that's magnetic, which is nice. And the magnets are pretty strong, but I do feel like the Link 2 magnets are a little bit stronger. But overall, feels really good. The mount is the exact same mount that comes with the Link 2, so they're using the exact same mount between the two. So you can also pull this one up. Again, the magnet's not nearly as strong, so you do have to manually adjust it. But you do have this extra adjustment for the vertical, which is kind of cool. And you got that going. But with the Link 2C, none of the other sides are magnetic, so the only way that you can mount this is in this single position, unless you use something like a tripod that will allow you to put it into a different position. And finally, we have the Meet 2. Now, this is physically very different from the Tiny 2 Lite, unlike the two Insta360 cameras. It's a little square here. It has a similar mounting system as the Link 2C, where it has a separate mount and it magnetizes to the bottom there, which is really nice to see. The privacy screen or the privacy cover is just a magnet that goes onto the cover here. Unfortunately, it's an all metal one because it is magnetized, but that leads to some scratches. So I unfortunately already have a scratch on there from the privacy screen kind of moving across it. So that's really unfortunate. I'm not a big fan. And unfortunately as well, because the way that this camera works, where there's no magnets actually integrated in here, it is magnetic because it's metal. So it'll still touch the mount, but there's no actual magnets in here. So there's nowhere to hold the privacy screen when you're not using it, unless you like kind of stick it onto the mount somewhere, which is, I guess, something that you can do. But one of the nice things about this design is that it is able to be mounted in 3 different positions. So you can have it in portrait mode here, but you can also put it in 2 different vertical modes, which is really nice to see. I just wish the magnets were maybe a little bit stronger because it does seem a little bit weak. When your cable is hanging out the back, it does move quite a bit with the cable tautness sometimes. So you do have to keep that in mind. It's a little bit hard to keep it in a singular position. And unlike the Insta360 cameras, again, the bottom is not magnetic, so you can't really mount it anywhere else. You do have the thread if you want to go ahead and put it on a tripod, but if you want to get a little bit creative with, you know, sticking this on something and using it as a different point of view, you have to use the mount. And this is the other kind of downside with this camera. Unfortunately, the mount is very loose. I've tried tightening the screws. It's a lot harder to keep this mount in a good position compared to the Insta360 ones. I feel like their mount is just a little bit better. This mount is a mix of like plastic and rubber with the magnet in there. I just feel like the Insta360 ones just work overall a little bit better. And so what I was thinking is I was going to use the OBSBOT on the Insta360 mount, but unfortunately they have the opposite magnets on the bottom here, so it doesn't really work nearly as well. It works great in the vertical position, so if I do want to use the vertical position, this is definitely the mount that I would end up using for that. But I have been struggling a little bit more with this, so I've been just trying to keep it and moving the cables in the back to keep them so they're not moving the camera, because I did have a bit of a twisting issue with the camera where it would just slowly twist itself over time with the way that the cables were in the back, and I'll kind of show you how that looks. Now, in terms of the specs, these are almost the exact same camera as their bigger brothers. These sensors are the exact same, so they support the same video resolutions, they have the same aperture, same sensor size, same FOVs, same digital zoom. They both support their gestures. They both have the same autofocus with PDAF. And the manual focus, they both support HDR, although a little bit differently, as mentioned before. They both have their omnidirectional microphones. But obviously, these ones do not have a physical gimbal like their bigger brothers do. And again, the price difference here is quite drastic. And the price here, again, is where we do see a pretty big difference. The Meet 2 is an MSRP of $129.99, and we haven't seen any sales on this because it is relatively new. The Link 2C's MSRP is $149.99, so it is an extra $20 difference over the Meet 2. All right, so this is what the Link 2 and the Tiny 2 Lite both look like. Now, the Link 2 is on the right and the Tiny 2 Lite is on the left. And if we go ahead and look at them on my monitor here, you can see that they both do certain things well versus one another. The Tiny 2 has a more yellow tone to the background, which doesn't bring out as much of the redness in my skin. Like the Link 2, you could see in my cheeks and in my head. I'm bald, so it makes it very easy. You could see a lot of redness in my skin. And the Link 2 also has what seems to be a little bit of over sharpening. The detail looks really, really good, but it does make it seem a little bit too over sharpened. You can see a lot of the pores in my skin, and it doesn't look as appealing overall. But I do think it looks a lot more crisp overall, and I think that the overall color of the Link 2 is actually a little bit more accurate. The main reason I say that is if we go ahead and look at it in a full screen view, we can see that the wall here has a little bit of a yellowish tinge to it. This is a completely white wall, so it has a little bit of a yellow kind of color to it. It looks a little bit more on the warmer side versus the Link 2, which is much more white overall. But it is a relatively minor thing to notice. You can also see it in the side-by-side here. You can kind of see that the yellow and the white kind of on that side. It's not a huge difference, and both of these can be adjusted pretty well within their settings, but it is to note that these are completely default out-of-the-box settings. Everything is set to the default, and that's how both of these cameras look, but these are both running at 4K 30. They both overall look really, really good. It just, there is a little bit of that differencing. You can even see in the heathering of my shirt, the Link 2 and the Tiny 2 Lite both show it a little bit differently. The Tiny 2 Lite shows a lot more of the difference in the heathering, whereas the Link 2 does not, so that's also a little bit more noticeable. But overall, both of these cameras do things pretty well, and they just kind of have certain strengths that the other one doesn't, and it's kind of a back and forth. But again, overall, you could adjust both of these settings to be very, very similar, especially in terms of the overall color. Now that we've got them side by side, let's go ahead and compare a few of the other features. For example, let's go ahead and compare their focus speeds and their focus accuracy. So both cameras have a minimum focus distance of about 10 centimeters. They both use phase detection autofocus to really quickly and really accurately grab focus on everything. So let's go ahead and compare the speed at which they both focus. So we have a little Bowser, little figurine here, and if we go ahead and pull it up to the cameras, you can see that it pulls focus on it pretty quickly. So it does a pretty good job, and both of these cameras do much better if you're putting the object directly in front of your face, because if you do put it off to the side of your face, it'll often end up trying to grab focus on your face instead. So it's a little bit hard because the cameras aren't directly lined up. But the Tiny 2 Lite does a pretty good job. The Link 2 does a pretty good job. One big difference, however, is that the Tiny 2 Lite does have two different focus modes. So you can set it between focusing on faces or focusing on global. If you're going to be doing a lot of stuff like this, if I go ahead and change that focus mode, just to go ahead and show, if I change it to a global mode, anything that's closer to the lens will be the thing that's in focused. It doesn't matter if it's my face or not. If my face is visible, I mean. So this is on the global mode, and if I go ahead and change it now to the face mode, so this is in global mode. It's still struggling a little bit. It's still in global. I haven't changed it yet. So that is in global mode, and it's now kind of doing the phase popping, which is not great. But if we go ahead and change it to face, now it's just kind of focused on my face, and global will kind of sometimes move around. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It does do a little bit of a difference, I've noticed. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Tiny 2 Lite focusing a little bit later as well, because it does seem to struggle a little bit more in low light situations when in a static position. If you're using tracking, it seems to be pretty good. But if you're using it in a static position without tracking on, in low light positions, it does often end up losing my face in terms of focus, and then I have to end up getting really close to the camera or turning on a brighter light, especially when I'm streaming, in order to get that focus to pull back again. So that is something to note. But overall, they do a pretty good job. They don't do too much focus breathing unless they're struggling to go between objects, but the quickness that they focus is actually really nice. So you can see that they pull and change focus really, really quickly overall. So I'm overall pretty impressed with it. All right, so speaking of low light performance, we're gonna go ahead and test these cameras in a few different scenarios. We're gonna go ahead and test them with the recording lights turned off, and we're just gonna be using the natural light coming in from the window here. I have kind of a sheer curtain, so it does soften the light coming in. So we'll see how that looks. We'll go ahead and do it with lights off, but we're gonna turn on just the standard room light. It's gonna be a little bit more representation of, using it in a work environment. You're gonna wanna have a light on. You're probably not gonna have recording lights, but you're gonna wanna have some kind of light on. Then we're gonna go to really low light performance, where we're gonna go ahead and close the curtain, see how that performs without any additional lights on. And then I'm gonna do one where it's a little bit more reflective of my streaming setup, where I do have some background kind of ambient light using a colored light, and we're gonna see how they perform in that position as well. All right, so this is what the cameras look like with all of the lights off. We have the natural light coming in from the window, and both of them are struggling a little bit on the side of my head. I'm bald, so it does make it a little bit more difficult for the cameras, but you can see there's a little bit of overexposure, a little bit of kind of blowing out, more so on the Tiny 2 Lite, I would say, than the Link 2. The Link 2 is doing a little bit of a better job, but the Tiny 2 Lite is really blowing out there. And again, these are on the standard settings. So if this is something that you're gonna be doing more often, I would definitely suggest having a setting preset done where it's meant for low light. But overall, they're still doing pretty well. They're not too noisy. You can see a little bit of noise, especially in the wall here, but it's not too bad. We're still getting a decent amount of light in this room considering, and overall, I think these are both performing still pretty good. So now we just went ahead and turned on the light above me. It's a less than ideal lighting situation. It's gonna cause a lot of shadows. But again here, both of the cameras do a pretty decent job. I wouldn't really say that one's doing better than the other. The Link 2 with the additional sharpening does look a little bit more crisp, but the Tiny 2 Lite does look a little bit less aggressive overall. They both do their things well, and they're both performing pretty well here. But you can definitely notice that the noise on the wall is pretty much gone for the most part at this light level, so that's great. All right, so this is with all lights off. I've closed the curtains. There's still a little bit of bleed coming through from the side of the blackout curtains, but this room's pretty dark right now. Both cameras are still doing pretty well. You don't see too much FPS drops from them struggling to keep up. The ISOs are definitely getting put to work here. You can see a lot more graininess in the wall here now. The Tiny 2 Lite seems to be doing a little bit of a better job than the Link 2. The Link 2's got a lot more grain and noise in that wall than the Tiny 2 Lite does. So that's something to keep in mind. Overall, the colors are still kind of staying the same as they were across the board. The Tiny 2 Lite looks a little bit more on the yellowish side, whereas the Link 2 has a little bit more of that reddish color to my skin especially. And this is what the two cameras look like with no lights on whatsoever. The only light in here right now is my computer and the lights coming off the monitors, and technically I got an extra monitor here, more than usual, to help with all the recording. So this is how they both look. Honestly, the OBSBOT seems to be doing a little bit better in terms of the low light performance. It's a lot less noisy. The contrast it's keeping is pretty good. I'm pretty overall happy with it. It's one of the reasons I like using the OBSBOT for my streams and stuff. The only thing is that whole focus issue that I end up running into. And, overall, both cameras still look good. And it's not super noticeable unless you look at the wall here. And once we get to the 4 cameras, you'll see it a little bit more as well. But there is a little bit of a difference here. Again, this is like the worst lighting scenario you can give these cameras, just to be clear. So let's go ahead and turn on the lights that I use when I stream, which is still a less than ideal, quite a bit less than ideal lighting scenario, and we'll see how they look there. All right, so this is the lighting setup that I usually use when I'm streaming, typically when I'm streaming at night, obviously. And again, I still think that the OBSBOT looks quite a bit cleaner. The overall color looks pretty good. The Tiny 2 you know, it looks nice. The Link 2, however, doesn't look bad. It's just the noise is a lot more noticeable, especially on the wider areas of the image. It sticks out quite a bit, and now it kind of seems like a little bit of a flip where the OBSBOT looks a little bit more crisp and a little bit more sharp, whereas the Link 2, the Insta360, is starting to look a little bit blurry, especially when you look at the stuff above my head here. It's just not looking nearly as crisp. So again, this is my typical lighting scenario. This is the way that I like streaming at nighttime. I don't like having a lot of additional lights. It is putting both of these cameras under a lot of strain to try to keep up with this. It's not their ideal scenarios, but this is the way that I kind of like it. And again, we're still kind of noticing a little bit of difference, especially like, you know, the road here, you can read it pretty clearly with the Tiny 2, but with the Link 2, you can't really read it nearly as well. So something to keep in mind. They still both look good. I just think the OBSBOT's got a little bit of an edge here. All right, and this is what the two cameras look like at 1080p 60. All right, and so here's what the two cameras look like at 1080p 60 with my studio lighting. They both look good. I kind of feel like the Tiny Lite. Now here's what the cameras look like at 1080p 60 instead of 4K 30. They both still look pretty good. I'm still overall quite impressed with them. The Tiny 2 Lite does seem to somehow be a little bit more yellow than it was before. And I don't know if it's because of the coloring, but I feel like I can see a little bit of pixelization around my eyes. If I go ahead and punch in, I might be able to see that a little bit better in post. But I am noticing that there is a little bit less sharpness on the Link 2. For example, the road words on my microphone here are a little bit harder to read. The background looks less in focus. I don't know if that's a bokeh thing. If I move closer to the camera, they both seem pretty good. But yeah, this is what they both look like at 1080p 60. I used to use my webcams at 1080p 60 instead of 4K 30, but in lower light situations, cameras will usually struggle a little bit more at 1080p 60 because they have to have a much higher shutter speed, which means that they have to pump up the ISO to get the same amount of light into the lens to be able to see you properly. And most of my streams I do in a pretty dark situation, so I've been doing the 4K 30 lately. It's been pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. I kind of like how the cameras look. And yeah, so this is what the cameras look like at 1080p 60. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and compare the microphones. Now they're both currently set at their default, and what we're going to do is we're going to step through their different mic settings. What they really do is they just kind of control the noise isolation or noise suppression that the microphones do using AI and software. So right now, again, they're both on their defaults. We'll start off with the Link 2, and currently the Link 2 is in what's called voice focus mode. What that does is it reduces background noise and makes your voice clearer. It's ideal for close range audio pickup. So this is what it sounds like with me just talking. And this is what it sounds like with me clapping beside my face. We'll move it a little bit closer to my mouth and we'll move it further away. Now, next up is the Link 2 in voice suppression mode. This enhances and highlights your voice, filtering out other voices and background noise. So this is what it sounds like without any additional noise other than the computers going on in the background. And this is what it sounds like with the clapping. Again, we'll go away from my mouth and we'll bring it in front. And then we'll bring it back forward. And finally, for the Link 2, this is called music balance mode. This basically turns off any of the AI noise cancellation on the webcam and just kind of has it as a default. So this is what it's going to sound like without any kind of noise suppression or anything like that on the camera. So again, we'll clap in front of my mouth here. We'll move it over to the side and then we'll bring it back into the front. And this is what it sounds like. Now, OBSBOT settings are a little bit different. So they have a noise reduction and they have off, weak, medium, or strong. So by default, it is set to medium. So the medium, this is what it sounds like. If you go ahead and clap right in front of us, we move it off to the side here and then move back to the front. Next up, we'll go ahead and turn it to the strong setting. So this is what it sounds like with the strong setting. Again, just the computer noises right now. And now we'll go ahead and start clapping. So clapping in front of my face, clapping to the left, and clapping back into the front. Now we have the OBSBOT set to the weak setting. So this is what the weak setting sounds like without any additional noise. And now we got the clapping here, and clapping to the left, and clapping back onto the right, and we'll kind of see how that sounds when we're talking. And finally, this is with the noise reduction set completely off. So this is what it sounds like without that on, without any kind of additional noise. And this is what it sounds like with the clapping in the front, the clapping on the left, and then the clapping back in the front. Now, in terms of the static cameras, the visual quality is going to be the exact same as their older siblings because the sensor is the exact same. The only difference is going to be the way that they track one another throughout the space, and we'll go over tracking in a second. But the mic quality is also going to be the same between them. They both use the same kind of technology for their microphone, but throughout this little clip here, I will switch between the microphone of the two devices so that you can hear them in their standard modes. We're not going to do any of the fancy modes or anything like that. But yeah, so we're going to go ahead now and we're going to compare these cameras along with their bigger brothers in a low light setting. We're going to do kind of a little 4-piece. We're going to compare them all, see how they all look in the low light against one another, specifically more so in my streaming setup because that's the way that I use these cameras most. And that's where I can sense a little bit more of the differences between them all as well. But here we have all 4 cameras alongside one another. We will hop between the microphones of them all as well so that you can kind of see how they all sound like compared to one another, all at the default sound settings. Again, these are all the default color settings, and as you can tell, the ones from the same manufacturer look extremely similar. The only difference really is going to be the kind of positioning, because it is a little bit hard to stack 4 webcams all beside each other, especially with the 2 cameras that move around. They take a lot more space. But yeah, overall, this is how they all look like in my recording lights during the day with a little bit of natural light coming through the window here. And let's go ahead. We'll cut over to some lower light situations and see how they all perform. Now, this is how all of the cameras look with just the light above that we had done before. Still, we have some natural light coming through the window here, but we're mainly being lit by above, just a warmer light above me as well. You get a little bit more shadowing on my face. But again, this is what they all kind of look like compared to one another. And here we have with all the lights off and just the natural light coming through the window here. And again, not much of a difference here. We have all of the cameras kind of performing the exact same within their manufacturers, and it doesn't really change all too much compared to what we looked at earlier with the 2 more expensive cameras compared side by side. The OBSBOT cameras still, you can really tell it in the wall. So in this wall here, you can see the noise difference between the cameras. It's pretty noticeable. I think the OBSBOT cameras have a little bit of an edge. They look really good. They're performing here really, really well. The Insta360 cameras don't look terrible, but now their coloring looks a little bit weird. Like the light looks blue but purple. Whereas the OBSBOT, it's all purple, which is what the lights are set to right now. And the noise is just the biggest difference, the biggest one that I notice, like right off the bat. And yeah, so this is the streaming light scenario that I like using. And here's a pretty good comparison of them all. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and compare the tracking between the cameras. So we're gonna start with the gimbaled cameras first, so the Tiny 2 Lite and the Link 2. And we're going to do it in this desktop view so that you can go ahead and see the settings that I'm changing here. And we'll be able to see the cameras at the same time because the software does do things a little bit differently between the two, especially once we get into a different type of tracking. So first off, we're going to do the gimbal only tracking for both of these cameras. So with the OBSBOT, we just go ahead and turn on the normal tracking. And with the Link 2, we just go ahead and turn on AI tracking. So now these are only going to go ahead and use the gimbals to follow me around. So if I go ahead and stand up, they should both follow me. And then if we move around the room, we should see that they try to keep my head kind of in the center of the frame a little bit. I don't have a ton of space in here, but I'll try my best to use up as much space as I can. So this is with just the gimbal tracking. And the one thing I do notice is that the OBSBOT does seem to chase me more, whereas the Link 2 does seem to do a better job of keeping me in the center third of the frame. Overall, it doesn't seem to struggle as much, especially if I do quick movement. So if I stand here and then I quickly move over to the side, The OBSBOT really seems to chase me over, whereas the Link 2 is much more gradual. It just does a better job of keeping me in that center overall, which makes sense. You know, Insta360 does do a lot of action cameras. They have a lot of gimbal products. So it does make a little bit sense that maybe their tracking software and just their functionality may be a little bit better, but this is how they both are. Now, one other big difference is that the Link 2 has the ability to change the tracking speed, whereas the OBSBOT does not. So in the Link 2 software, right now it's on ordinary speed, which is the default. You can turn it on the quick mode, which I don't really like because it's very jittery and it's very fast, but you can have it on this mode as well, and it'll track things a lot faster. So if you're doing a lot of quick movements, this might be a little bit better, but I personally prefer the slow tracking speed. It's the most smooth, and I don't typically move around that quickly, so if I am going to be using this, I would prefer it to be on the slower mode. It just seems a little bit more natural, a little less jarring. I overall just kind of like it a little bit more. So both cameras also have the ability to do a smart composition or a smart framing, which is additional tracking on top of the gimbal, which allows the cameras to zoom in or punch into a frame to do some kind of additional tracking. So with OBSBOT, let's go ahead and choose close up. And with the Link 2, we'll turn on smart composition and we'll choose head. And now if we go ahead, it's going to zoom in on top of tracking me around with the gimbal, and it's going to use that zoom to try to keep me as much in the center of the frame as possible. And you can see the zoom on both of the software. So right now the Link 2 is about 2.5 times, whereas the OBSBOT is about 1.67. I can't really read that, it's pretty far away. But we'll see how they adjust. Now, one thing that I notice, especially with the Link software, it doesn't do a very good job of keeping a more constant zoom amount. It goes in and out a lot, especially if you move your hands around. It will move in and out depending on how you're moving. It will zoom in and zoom out kind of sporadically. Right now it's doing a pretty good job of locking it on my head, and it's pretty zoomed in, but the two cameras are at a different zoom level. If I go ahead and change the Link 2 to something like a half body, now their zoom levels are a little bit more similar to one another. Now the Link 2 is still more zoomed in, but you can see it zooms in and out quite a bit here. And the OBSBOT is still doing about mid chest up, whereas the OBSBOT in the half body is doing about top chest up. If we change the OBSBOT to upper body, we go ahead and do that, it's basically doing from waist up. So you got quite a few more modes on the OBSBOT, but we'll get over some of the other ones that I don't think are as nearly as useful. And then with the Link 2, we have a whole body mode here. And it definitely seems to keep a little bit more of me, but there's a lot of space here. It seems to really try to keep my head just in the center frame. And I don't know why it's kind of doing that. You can't really adjust it. If I go ahead and move a little bit further, the other camera's going to start getting in the way here. But, I mean, it does a better job. So if you're really far away from your camera, this is something that would be useful. But I don't know. It doesn't seem to work that great for me. And at that point, I feel like if you just turn off the tracking and you have to make sure that both of them are reset to 1 times, I feel like that does basically the same thing in terms of the amount that it's keeping me in there. Maybe the Link 2 was showing a little bit more legs on the whole body, but I don't know. Can't really notice too much of a difference. My room isn't the biggest, so it's a little bit hard to test, but it's also not the smallest room either. So really not sure what to do there. And if we go ahead and turn that back on, we'll turn that to half body. And with the OBSBOT, if we go ahead and we do the headless, it's going to go ahead and it's going to lock on basically right on my torso. So not entirely sure what this would be used for. Maybe if you do a lot of like workout style streams, you're doing some kind of exercise, yoga, Pilates, maybe you do body art, this might be helpful. You know, I do workouts and stuff on stream when people redeem points. You know, I'll do curls and I'll do like push-ups and stuff. So like maybe that would be useful. Not entirely sure, but what's even less useful to me is the lower body mode. Not really sure what you would use this for. Maybe again, if you're doing workouts, you know, I do squats, so like it'll keep the camera on my lower body when I'm doing squats. seems a little bit odd. You know, again, maybe if you're doing workouts and you're doing like leg exercises or you're doing Pilates or something like that, maybe. I'm just not entirely sure what it would be useful for, but it is nice that OBSBOT does have a few additional settings, even though I don't really know what they would be useful for. Now, if we switch these to the static cameras, they don't have the gimbal ability to track you, but they do use the smart composition and smart framing. So that's where their bread and butter for the tracking comes in here. So we have the auto framing on OBSBOT. We turn that one on. In upper body mode, it'll keep us in frame here. And then we have the Link 2C, and let's go ahead and do half body. And that's kind of where it's at. I don't really have a lot of space here, so I'm going to try to make this work because the static cameras don't really have nearly as much kind of room. I might have to turn, there we go, I got to turn the auto framing on. So again, it is zooming in quite a bit for the Link 2. I feel like this is zooming in maybe a little bit too much, but doing my best to try to keep in frame. I think the OBSBOT does a really good job with the auto framing here. It's keeping everything crisp. Both of these cameras with the 4K 30 are keeping a lot of good detail as well when they're doing these punch-ins, so it doesn't really, it's not super noticeable that they're doing a lot of these zooms. Both of them can go up to like 4x zoom without any major quality drops, so that's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and change the Link 2 to head, Link 2C. So that really does zoom in, but again, it zooms in and out a lot based on your movement. I feel like it shifts way too much. Not super happy about that, but if we go ahead and turn the OBSBOT to single close-up, doesn't go in nearly as much as the Link 2, but it does do a better job of keeping a particular zoom and not hopping in and out of that zoom nearly as much. Whereas you can see the Link 2 is still hopping in and out, Link 2C, sorry, is still hopping in and out and zooming in more and more and more on my mouth. It's not even, maybe I gotta squat down more. I'm not really sure. See, like it's just, it moves around quite a bit. So I think OBSBOT does a little bit better with the smart comp, whereas the Insta360 cameras do a little bit better, well, specifically the Link 2 only does a little bit better with just the gimbal. One thing to keep in mind as well is that with both cameras, once you turn off the auto framing or the smart framing, you gotta zoom them out to make sure that you're back to your standard settings so that you don't accidentally stay zoomed in. So now let's talk about how using these cameras in vertical is quite a bit different between all of them, even the cameras from the same manufacturer. So the Meet 2 can be physically rotated because, as I mentioned earlier, the sides and the bottom are all magnetic. So you can just physically rotate the camera on your included mount and put it into portrait mode. The only thing that I don't like about this experience, and it may be something that they can adjust, is that you have to manually go into the software and adjust it to 90 degrees over. It doesn't automatically notice that you've moved it over and rotated it, but it does a decent job once you go ahead and do that, and it is the simplest to set up out of all the cameras. Now with the Tiny 2 Lite, unfortunately, if you're not using any kind of tripod or ball head for this, it is going to cover a significant portion of your screen because the mount is built into the camera and you can't really move them separately. So you can still use it in portrait, it's just going to cover a significant portion of your screen, and you are still going to have to go ahead and do that rotation in the software. So the nice thing about the Link 2 is that it can be set up in a vertical mount mode. With using the included mount, you don't have to use anything special. It is a little bit hard to balance because it becomes very front heavy. So you may have to have the cable kind of pulling it down in the back to counteract that. But it does set up really, really easily. You do have to auto rotate it in the software afterwards. But it does set up really, really well. And the controls actually realize its orientation, and it'll actually change their like the way that they move based on the position of the camera, which is why I'm a little bit surprised it doesn't automatically adjust the orientation in the software. But it is a relatively quick fix to do and doesn't take too long. And the Link 2C is the worst at being set up as vertical straight out of the box because the Link 2C, the bottom is the only side that's magnetic, so neither of the sides are magnetic, so you can't rotate it on the mount like you can with the Meet 2. The only way you can do it is if you mount it onto some kind of tripod or ball head. And as I mentioned in my Link 2C review, I got some tripods from Insta360 with the camera, so using that, I can go ahead and put it into the vertical mode. But if you don't have that and you don't have a ball mount or a tripod, you're gonna have to go out and get one in order to use the Link 2C in a vertical mode, unlike almost all of the other cameras, which you can do straight out of the box. Some of them a little bit easier than others, but at least you could do them all straight out of the box. Okay, so now let's hop into the software and we're just gonna compare the software between Insta360's Link controller and OBSBOT's center. So we'll start off with Insta360 since I have it open here. And we're using the Link 2 right now. If you want to switch the cameras, it's pretty easy. You just pull from the drop down. We're going to go ahead and switch between these two cameras to show some slight differences. But with the Link 2, we have the view adjustment here. We can save up to 10 presets, which is really, really nice. You can set up to 10 presets, and that includes all of the image settings, all of the effect settings, the color settings, all that kind of stuff. The actual physical position, whether it's tracking you or not tracking you. A lot of really great stuff, which is really nice to see. And then we have the additional tracking settings, so the smart compositions that we were using earlier. You can set up the ability to do pause track areas, and if you want to see how that works, you can go ahead and check out the dedicated review for the Link 2. I go over that in detail, but it's a pretty cool feature where you can set up certain areas where once it passes over that area, it'll stop there and keep it on there until you move away from it. It's pretty cool, so you can kind of like pre-frame certain areas of your office, for example. I mentioned it's really, really good for that kind of situation, like an office or presentations. You can set the tracking speed, and as I mentioned, I prefer it on slow. You can enable the auto tracking, so it'll just always try to keep your face in frame, and it does a few other things. When you manually adjust the gimbal to face yourself, it'll automatically start tracking, so that's kind of cool. And it also has the ability to turn on and off the tap control, which enables and disables the tracking modes if you want to go ahead and use that. I don't personally use it. I have it on, but I never really physically touch the camera. Now on the bottom here, we also have the ability to turn on and off the AI tracking. We have the ability to use the whiteboard mode, which is kind of unique and really nice. The smart whiteboard, which is also cool, and the desk view, which is something that I actually do use. And obviously the two gimbal cameras are able to do the desk view stuff a lot better than the static cameras because they're able to physically move down. So they're not using as much of the AI trickery to kind of auto adjust the images. But they all do a really good job. I do like the desk view on the Link series a little bit better. It does seem to perform a little bit better. Another nice thing on this page is that you're able to change the ratio, resolution, and frame rate directly within this screen. You don't have to open up anything additional, which is nice. I really do like that. And you can turn on and off the preview with the Link 2 by default. As soon as you open the software, if nothing else is using the camera, it's going to turn on the preview for you. And then if you're going to go ahead and add your camera to something like OBS, but you want to keep the Link 2 controller open, you have to make sure that you turn off the preview so that in OBS it can pull the camera because multiple sources can't use the camera at once. Now to quickly go through some of the effects, we have the color settings here so we can set the exposure. As I mentioned, I often like turning this auto exposure offset down a little bit to keep it a little bit away from overexposing, especially with the studio lights. You can change the autofocus, the white balance, brightness, contrast, saturation, sharpness. You can have HDR on. And the nice thing about the Link 2 and the Link 2C is that HDR works in the higher frame rate of 60 frames per second. So that's pretty nice. And then you can have the auto flicker. You can manually set it or have it so that it's auto set. You can also set a whole bunch of color presets here. So you can set one for studio lights. You can set one for streaming setup. You can set one for no lights, all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty nice. Then you have the ability to use all the background stuff here. Now, all of these effects, the background, the makeup, and the filters only work on the virtual camera. It doesn't work on the actual camera output itself. So virtual cameras we'll get through in a little bit, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. I don't personally use any of these effects. The nice thing about a lot of software, if you are going to be using it, is that things like for meetings are all going to have a blur background built into them as well. So you don't have to go ahead and use it in the software. You can usually do the background replacement and stuff. The only time you would really have to use this is if you're going to be doing it in something like OBS, but then even there you have a bunch of options as well. So again, I don't personally use any of these, and they're only available if you go ahead and use the virtual camera. So as you see, as soon as I hit that background, it turned on the virtual camera. And the quality difference in the virtual cameras is a little bit different. And again, we'll go into that at the end once we kind of summarize the software between both of these manufacturers. And finally, in the Insta360, we can turn on and off the gestures. So I have most of the gestures turned off. I use my hands a lot when I talk, maybe my Italian background, but I use my hands a lot when I talk, and I don't like the gestures turning things on and off while I'm not really meaning to. So I do have it off, but you can use, full palm to turn on and off the AI tracking. You can use the peace sign to do the whiteboard and the pinching to do zooming and zooming out. Again, that's all in the dedicated review. If you do want to check out how those work, we can change our audio mode. We can go ahead and change some additional settings here. So horizontal flip, vertical flip, smart adjustment, which just will always try to search my head and try to keep that at an optimal frame. And then you can make it so that it mutes the microphone when the camera is put to sleep. And then you also have the compatibility settings, so portrait resolution and high frame rate, as well as the enable low res. All right, so now let's talk about OBSBOT Center. And as we can see here, by default, when you turn on the software, it does not have the preview. You have to turn on the preview. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. It has my output settings on there. So right now, for some reason, the image switched to a -1. Let's go ahead and reset that so that it's not super dark. And here we go. So very similar kind of layout here. We have the ability to turn on the tracking. So right now it's just on standard mode, so it's not tracking anything at all. You go ahead and turn on the normal tracking, it'll move us around, all those additional settings that we looked at earlier. On the OBSBOT software, we only have the ability to put 3 presets. So the Link software has a big benefit there because you can do 10. Only having 3 is a little bit unfortunate. I don't particularly like that. I wish there was more options. And that might be something they can add in future revisions of the software to add more presets. It would be nice. Down here, we have the ability to move the gimbal around. And as you can see, if we pop this out, we can move our gimbal speed so that when we move it around, it'll kind of just change how quickly that moves around. But unfortunately, this gimbal speed only applies to manually moving the camera around. It does not apply to how quickly the camera moves when in auto tracking mode, which is a little bit unfortunate. I don't like that. I do wish that there would be a setting to kind of control the speed of the gimbal. So it is unfortunate. You can adjust your zoom and stuff here, so that's cool. You can adjust the field of view. So this is like the standard full wide mode. Medium punches it in, narrow punches it in even more. And then you can reset all of your settings here as well. Now on the image tab, we have the ability to adjust the focus, and this is what we were showing earlier where you can do the face versus the global focus, which is nice. You have all of your exposure settings. We're gonna go ahead and reset that again because it keeps on switching it to -1. So we have that ability there. Again, we can do face and global for the auto exposure. Anti-flicker, we can have that set to off or 60 or 50. I don't have any flickering lights behind me, so I don't particularly need it on. You can adjust your white balance and then again, all of your color settings. Now, one big difference with the OBSBOT compared to the Insta360 cameras is HDR only works at a maximum frame rate of 30 frames per second. It does not work in the higher frame rates. So if you are someone who likes using HDR and wants to use 1080p 60, for example, the OBSBOT won't be able to do that. You can only do it at 30 frames or less, but it does it in the supported resolutions of 4K, 1080p, and 720p. Now on the More tab here, we're able to adjust our initial state. So that's just where the camera starts off, and you can set one of your presets to the initial state as well. So that's kind of cool. One thing that I really do like about the OBSBOT software is the ability to control the sleep. So you can have it set to auto sleep, you can set the timer, and then you can also set the image so that when you go ahead and put the camera to sleep, it'll still output an image, but you get to select what it is. So by default, it's this one. So if I go ahead and sleep the camera, it's just gonna say come back soon. If I go ahead and unsleep it, but you can change it to your own images if you want. So I obviously have my face to be a little creepy. It is nice that you have that additional functionality, and it's nice that you can sleep the camera directly within the software, which you cannot do with the Insta360 cameras. You have to physically turn down the Link 2 or turn the privacy screen or change the privacy shutter on the Link 2C to put it into sleep mode. They don't have the ability to do it directly within the software. And then we also have the ability to turn on and off the gesture controls. Again, if you want to see these be a little bit more in depth, you can check out the OBSBOT Tiny 2 review where I go through these a little bit more in depth. But they're all there. We have the ability to change our audio settings. Also here, you can disable the microphone completely if you don't ever plan on using it, which seems to be the thing for a lot of people. And then you can mirror your image. You can change the way that the controls work in terms of the reversing them. You can turn the indicator light off if you want, and you got all that. Now, before I go into my rant about the virtual cameras, overall, I think that the Link 2 software is a little bit more user friendly. I like the UI a little bit better. OBSBOT has dealt with this a little bit by they actually added a light mode, which simplifies the software a little bit and makes it a little bit less daunting for people. So if you aren't going to be using all of those settings, you can just use the light mode. It really condenses down the amount of stuff that's there. It really condenses everything into one little section. I feel like it might simplify it a little bit too much, but it is there as an option if you do want to go ahead and use it. But the one thing is that the OBSBOT has a few more settings that I do wish were available in the Insta360 software. The sleep settings, as I mentioned, are really great, and I do wish that Insta360 had those kinds of settings in there where you can kind of adjust and control the way that the sleep works. And being able to sleep and wake your cameras directly within the software is a really nice touch. Also, if you have a Stream Deck, your OBSBOT cameras can be controlled directly through the Stream Deck using an official plugin from OBSBOT, which is really, really nice because you don't have to use global hotkeys. You get a lot more granularity, a lot more control. It's quite a bit nicer than using global hotkeys, which is your only solution with Insta360. So if you do like controlling all of them a lot, that is a really great option, and it's one of the reasons why I like using the OBSBOT cameras as additional cameras. Lately, I've been using the Insta360 Link 2 as my main camera when I stream because it doesn't really move too much, and it just sits on my face. And then I've been using the Tiny 2 Lite as an additional camera because I can go ahead and adjust that on the fly quite a bit easier using my Stream Deck, moving it around, moving it between its positions. I just wish it had more than 3 preset positions. I wish it had 10 like the Insta360 software does. Now, as mentioned, with both software, whether it's OBSBOTs or Insta360s, the only way to use their filters or effects, so with OBSBOT, it's under the beauty tab. You can have blur, retouch, filters. And then with Insta360s, it's all on the effects tab. You can have all the background effects, the makeup effects, and the filters. Those can only be used with virtual cameras. And the virtual cameras just don't have the same quality output as the actual camera. So if you're not going to be using any effects, it really does tank the performance. I'm not overly a fan of using them. Insta360s are a little bit better. The blur and stuff is a little bit better on Insta360s, where with the OBSBOT, for example, the blur, there's a huge outline around me here. It doesn't look great. It doesn't really help very much. And I honestly think it doesn't look as nice as just using it within Zoom, for example, if you're going to be doing that. Whereas if we go ahead and go to the Insta360, we go ahead and turn on the background blur here. It's still not great, especially if you're bald. It doesn't seem to do a great job, but it does a better job than OBSBOT. So again, I'm not a big fan of using these effects, and having to use the virtual cameras to use the effects makes me want to use them even less. If it's something that you're interested in, there's plenty of people who have done a lot more of a comparison between how the virtual effects work between the two cameras. I don't personally use them. I don't like how you have to use the virtual cameras, and overall, I just don't think it's a great thing. But if it is something that you're interested in, they do have them available to you. You're just going to see a little bit of a drop in quality in terms of the overall camera when you end up using the virtual cameras, and none of them are perfect. So that's entirely up to you whether or not you want to use them. And comparing the two, I'm not going to be the greatest person because I just don't like really either solution very much. So this has been a long video, but I really do hope I've provided enough information to help you make a decision between all 4 of these cameras. They are all really good cameras, but they all have some strengths over one another. They all have a few weaknesses. Depending on your use case, one camera is going to be quite a bit better than one of the other ones. But image quality across the board, these are all really good, and you can't really go wrong with any of them. Now, if you're going to be doing more presenting in a physical space or move around a lot more in a room while using the camera, the Link 2 and the Tiny 2 Lite are going to be the ones that you should compare against. Whereas if you're mostly in a seated or static position most of the time, I think the Link 2C and the Meet are the ones that you should be considering. And choosing between those two is really going to be up to your personal opinion, what kind of features you prioritize over one another. Again, they all do things really well, but some of them just do one thing a little bit better, they do one thing a little bit worse, and depending on which one of those things you like the idea of more is going to be the one that you should probably choose. So do keep that in mind. But with all that said, I really do hope you found this video helpful, and if not, I at least hope you found it interesting. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribed. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can leave those down in the comment section below. I'm sure both manufacturers will be reading some of these comments, so if you want to give them any feedback, feel free to leave those down there as well. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors. A big thanks to you for watching to the end of this video. If you want to see any of the other videos where I go ahead and review and compare products, especially those previously mentioned full reviews that I've done on some of these cameras before, you can go ahead and check out the playlist right up here. And as always, stay safe out there. I'll see you next time.